And we'll kick things off with this conversation. South Africa is still grappling with one of the highest levels of crime in the world, and instances of murder, carjackings, home invasions, violent robberies and extortion sadly becoming commonplace. In response, the South African Police Service is increasing visibility, particularly through heightened patrols and increased presence of officers on the street as a crucial strategy to combat this crisis. This emphasis on police visibility prompts an important question, though. Can that be enough to ensure that there's an effective reduction in crime in South Africa? Let's have this discussion with Vanya Gastrow, a senior researcher with the Institute for Security Studies, and joining us now via our video link. Great to have you on the program, Vanya. Thanks very much indeed for making time to speak to us. And of course, full disclosure, we're speaking to you because you've written about this, and part of what you've mentioned is that there needs to be evidence-based policing. It's EBP. I don't want to take it for granted that that is self-explanatory. So perhaps we can begin by just unpacking that term itself. What kind of data are we talking about?
So, yes, it seems a bit confusing when people first hear the term. But yeah, thank you for having me on your show today. Evidence-based policing, it's quite simple. It's about before we introduce new strategies with regard to policing in South Africa or in any other context, we want to see what the evidence shows, whether the strategy works or not. And so evidence-based policing is, the concept is really to encourage policing authorities to look at data, to look at research, and to consider evidence, and use that to inform our strategies. And then in addition to that, to measure interventions and assess, did this intervention in this context in South Africa work? And so when it comes to visible policing, rather than just thinking, let's increase visibility, evidence-based policing involves looking at studies carried out in different parts of the world to find out what kind of visible patrols had the most impact on crime.
That's fascinating. I find typically, to make a point, it's great to have examples. And I wonder if you have instances, maybe even around the world, where increased police visibility in certain communities didn't necessarily reduce the level of crime there.
Yes, definitely. So there have been many studies carried out which showed that random patrolling, so just telling police officers to just drive around in a particular neighborhood, did not really have any impact on decreasing crime or preventing crime. And it could actually result in a huge waste of state resources if it's actually found not to work. But what studies do find, and that's sort of what we're trying to encourage in the South African context, is that if you use data to identify specific hotspots, and these are not entire suburbs, it's usually one block or a few streets where a lot of crime is concentrated. By increasing patrols in those hotspots, you can actually have a significant impact on reducing crime. Although I must also say that visible patrols is not going to solve on its own the crime problem in South Africa. It is just one part of many different strategies that the police and broader crime prevention agencies will use.
Absolutely.
Will need to use.
Right, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But the sense I'm getting from you, just to reiterate the point, is that if there's going to be more boots on the ground, that's the term that's typically thrown around, it needs to be more calculated, perhaps more intentional. And you speak about reading the data. The question I then suppose becomes, are we collecting the data accurately enough in order to make those kind of informed decisions?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. There is a lot of data that we can use at station level. Obviously, it could be better. Often this data isn't mapped. So if you're talking about visible patrol patrols and choosing hotspots, often we have the addresses, we have the locations, we have crime data, but it's not mapped adequately. So there's a bit of work involved in identifying hotspots. Another area of evidence-based policing when it comes to strategies regarding visible patrols is monitoring, because it's one thing to tell police to patrol a hotspot, but you also have to check if in practice they really are doing that. And a key part of evidence-based policing is actually tracking and monitoring. And I think that's also a challenge in the South African context where we don't always have sophisticated tracking and monitoring tools.
Fair enough. And you're right, patrolling, I imagine, is just one of several interventions that could help bring down crime levels, at least if it's done properly, as you've explained today. A lot of researchers have told us in many instances, some of the books I've read, that in many cases, people who would commit crime will consider if they'll be caught, rather than if there's, any kind of severe punishment for the crime, if they're going to try and ascertain if the crime itself is worth it. So what other kind of strategies do you reckon can be introduced with that in mind to ensure at the very least that people are deterred from committing these crimes?
Yes, so with the visible patrol strategy, it's actually not only about identifying hotspots, it's about police patrolling irregularly for short amounts of time. And apparently what it's been found to do is just to make people uncomfortable. They have a sense that the police could appear at any time. So the strategy isn't about having the police at the hotspot all the time, because that creates a sense of comfort, like, oh, the police are there all the time, so we can work around it. The police are there, sometimes they're not there, you don't know when they're arriving, and usually when they're there, they're only there for a short time, and that's also important in regard to the use of resources. It can be a huge waste to have people there all the time. So that is one way in which a strategy can create a sense of unease amongst potential criminals, because I think that sense of being an area being monitored and watched does put people off wanting to commit crime because of that fear of potentially being caught. Then there are all kinds of different evidence-based policing strategies. Not all of them relate only to visible patrols, but some of them actually relate more to crime prevention. How can we strengthen our leadership at station level? How can we improve communication between communities and police? So yeah, there are many different examples and approaches.
Right. In many instances, you need people to be able to devise these plans and to be able to ensure that, we see them through. You, for example, mentioned that it's one thing to deploy police there, it's another to make sure that they're actually doing the job once they get there. It's a very roundabout way of asking the question around resources and capacity. We've heard many instances that in a country like ours, sadly, we just don't have that kind of reach, given the budget cuts the SAPS, for example, has suffered over the years. Does that correlate with your own research?
By transplanting these kinds of strategies, it wouldn't work in the immediate term. I think things have to happen within public safety agencies to prepare for introducing these new kinds of strategies in terms of automating, making monitoring and tracking of police vehicles and police officials easier. But a lot of that is already happening. For example, SAPS vehicles are tracked through a technology called AVL. In Cape Town, the city officials carry personal tracking devices. So a lot of that is happening already. But yeah, I don't think institutions are right now prepared for many of these kinds of strategies, but it's not out of our reach.
Fair enough. I wonder to what extent, Vanya, trust plays an important role in seeing through some of these strategies and interventions. I mean, we live in a country where sadly the trust deficit between police and ordinary community members in some instances is widening. And, I'm just thinking about the ways in which it might complicate seeing some of these plans through.
I think we've had workshops where we've involved community policing structures, and to our surprise, we found that many of these community organizations and community leaders would like to see more police in their neighborhoods. So that contrasts a bit with other studies that have found the more police can actually undermine trust because people feel the police are targeting them, surveilling them, and it puts them on edge. Whereas in South Africa so far, although I think we'd have to do further research on it, there's actually an appreciation amongst many community members for having added police presence.
Sure. Very fascinating study indeed. And I hope certainly at some stage we'll be able to see some of those interventions introduced in places that need it most. Vanya Gastrow is a senior researcher with the Institute for Security Studies. Thanks very much indeed.